Carmine Galante was a mobster who frightened even the other Mafia men.
He was feared by everybody.
Even if he seemed old, he was deadly.
They were afraid of him. Don't mess with him.
Go to a hardware store and buy a can of nails. Look in the can, that's his face.
He had worked the mean streets for decades.
Carmine Galante was especially cunning. Not simply a predator himself, but a leader of predators.
At the age of 60, his career seemed finished. But from his prison cell, he masterminded an astonishing comeback and flooded New York's streets with heroin.
He was a big narcotics dealer, huge.
His drugs empire would become massive, but it would also make him a target. And his career would end in one of the most famous mob hits of them all.
Carmine was stepping up into a position they didn't want him in.
He wanted that control, and that was his downfall.
Knickerbocker Avenue, Brooklyn, New York. This is the site of one of the most notorious mob crimes ever. Number 205 was once Joe and Mary's restaurant. At the rear was a sheltered terrace. It was here, in the afternoon heat on July the 12th, 1979, that one of the city's biggest mobsters, Carmine Galante, was having lunch. And it was here that he was interrupted. Police officers responded to reports of gunshots and screams inside the restaurant.
The two gentlemen inside died as a result of multiple gunshot and shotgun wounds, and this will be examined further by autopsy.
Galante was victim of one of the most spectacular mob hits for years. It was a fitting end for the man who, more than any other, had been responsible for flooding the United States with heroin. Carmine Galante's career was built on heroin. In fact, he had been knee-deep in it since the 1950s.
That was his trade. He was a narcotics dealer from day one.
In 1957, 4,500 miles from Brooklyn in Palermo, Sicily, a key gathering was held. It took place at the Grand Hotel de Palm to welcome a special guest from America. That man was Joe Bonanno, boss of one of the 5 New York crime families.
When he went to Sicily, he was honored. It was like, you know, the king has returned, and they showed the greatest respect.
Bonanno had brought with him his trusted underboss, Carmine Galante.
He was a known assassin, so he carried a lot of weight in a business where weight counted an awful lot.
Short, stocky man, but very rough, tough, powerful.
Galante and Bonanno were here to discuss with the Sicilian Mafia a means of trafficking heroin into the United States. Galante would be Bonanno's heroin emissary. He would run all the drug side of the business for Bonanno's family. It is one of the myths of the stateside mafia that they didn't get involved in drugs. On the surface, US mafiosi portrayed themselves as men of traditional values, and drugs were not seen as an honorable sideline.
They held themselves out as men of honor, men of loyalty, obedient to old traditions, the way American society no longer was.
But the reality was very different.
Even though they were taboo in the early and mid-50s, all 5 families were involved in heroin trafficking.
From the moment that narcotics were illegal, it fell within their realm.
And Galante's aim was to be at the heart of the action.
Galante wanted to be the pipeline to the United States.
But drug trafficking was a high-risk activity. While the authorities might turn a blind eye to gambling or loan sharking, narcotics had always carried a hefty federal prison sentence. The rewards, however, outweighed the risks, especially if Galante could import the heroin wholesale from Sicily. The island was at the crossroads of the international heroin trade.
The majority of the heroin that was coming in was going through Sicily and smuggled into the United States.
The opium poppies were grown in Turkey. The opium was then refined into a so-called morphine base, usually in Lebanon. Next, it was transformed chemically into pure heroin in the French port of Marseille before being shipped on. This complex international journey from Turkey to North America through France became known as the French Connection. But it was once it was in the US that heroin became hugely profitable. 10 kilos of raw opium could be bought for $350. Once refined into 1 kilo of pure heroin, it was worth 1,000 times that. The pure imported heroin was sold on across the United States for vast profits.
The largest amount of money that could be made since Prohibition was narcotic trafficking. The millions and billions of dollars.
Galante and Bonanno had their eyes on these vast profits made by getting the drugs into the USA. It was to set up this complex smuggling network that the meeting with the Sicilian Mafia had been convened. As a result, Galante and Bonanno sewed up a large part of the supply of heroin for themselves. Their deal became known as the Palermo Summit. And from this point on, Galante began to dominate the heroin trade in the USA. Galante immediately set about overseeing his new business operation. He traveled to Miami, Cuba, Marseille, and above all, Canada. Galante knew Canada especially well. Much of his time in the 1950s was spent in Montreal, where he had risen to become one of the city's biggest mobsters by 1955.
Joe Bonanno sent him to Montreal to organize the rackets there on behalf of the Bonanno family. And one of those rackets is narcotic importation.
He built a network of contacts and a strong power base in Montreal. And it just so happened, Canada was one of the places where French Connection heroin made landfall in North America.
Drugs from Europe and the Middle East would basically go to Montreal or to Toronto. From Montreal, it was only a relatively short drive to New York City.
Galante made sure the drug was hidden in shipping consignments and then smuggled into the USA overland.
They were bringing it in, of course, in cars and in trucks and things like that. A lot of the major cases were in vehicles. You'd take a 20-gallon gas tank and you'd put in a tank that's only about a gallon just to get the car started and off the pier. And the rest of it was filled with heroin in that gas tank. The heroin was in the doors and things like that.
By the late 1950s, Galante was good at his job. He was importing large quantities of heroin.
The Galante organization out of Montreal brought in an estimated 600 kilograms of heroin a year.
Within a short space of time, Galante had built a hugely profitable international heroin smuggling network. But Galante didn't just operate out of Canada because it was good for business. It was also a good place to hide. In the United States itself, Galante was known to the FBI. In fact, the FBI had been tracking him for years. He was on their books as one of the top hoodlums in the country, with an impressive rap sheet. 1930, incarcerated Sing Sing prison, shooting at police detective. Prison assessment, emotionally dull, IQ of a 14-year-old. 1943, implicated as suspected killer of a dissident Italian journalist.
Back in the 1940s, when he was younger, he was suspected of killing a man named Carlo Tresca. That was a very sensational case. A lot of prominent people, very high-ranking Americans, were interested in that case.
He was never indicted due to a lack of witnesses. Although they couldn't pin anything on him, the FBI file on Galante showed they knew he was someone to watch out for. He should be considered armed and extremely dangerous. The file revealed the FBI knew where he had lived, including his Park Avenue address with views of the Chrysler Building. Even his business interests. For Galante, this law enforcement heat was enough to make him nervous, and was a good reason to remain on the run. But all of his narcotics trafficking had drawn the attention of yet another law enforcement agency, one that was even more fearsome than the FBI. It was called the FBN, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The FBN specifically targeted opium and heroin smuggling around the globe. The FBN and the FBI were supposed to get along, but there was a bitter rivalry between them.
The Federal Bureau of Investigations was a much bigger organization than the Bureau of Narcotics. It had 10 times as many agents. It had a budget that was at least 10 times as great, if not greater, than the Bureau of Narcotics.
The rivalry wasn't just professional, it was personal. The two leaders, J. Edgar Hoover for the FBI, Harry Anslinger for the FBN, despised each other. But at this stage, the FBN was way more effective than its federal rivals when it came to targeting the mob.
Of all the law enforcement agencies in the United States, it was the only one that seemed to know everything the Mafia was doing the minute it did it. And it was based largely on the fact that it had been compiling data on each and every mafioso, including Carmine Galante, since 1930.
And the FBN also had a better conviction rate. The reason? It had a powerful weapon at its disposal, the draconian 1956 Narcotics Control Act.
The Narcotics Control Act of 1956 mandated that anybody dealing in heroin could get mandatory sentences up to 40 years.
This was unlike any other country in the world. In Italy or France, people who were arrested with the for the same quantities of narcotics might serve 2 or 3 years in prison.
From 1959 onwards, the FBN began to target Galante actively. And soon, they had a breakthrough. They discovered where he was. Intelligence revealed that he had traveled from Canada back to New York on business and was in hiding. The FBN arrested him in 1961 on a charge of narcotics trafficking. Galante's case came to court in April 1962. He was about to feel the full force of the Narcotics Control Act. He got 20 years in prison, first at Alcatraz, and then at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Galante had been riding high. Now, he seemed to be washed up.
For Galante to get so many years in prison, I mean, it was a blow to him.
Thanks to the FBN, Galante's career seemed over. Few mobsters could rise again from such a stretch. But then, Galante wasn't just any mobster. Instead of despairing, prison focused Carmine Galante's mind. He started thinking about how to stage a comeback. Jail time hardened Galante's ambition to earn money and one day lead his family. The cornerstone of his stratagem would still be heroin. Even though he was in jail, Galante made sure he kept all his old heroin contacts and supply lines.
He did manage to stay involved in it even from prison.
He certainly had influence over the Bonanno family from prison.
He already had established the contacts in Sicily. They were still there. The Canadian contacts were there.
Then, he started to nurture an idea. To take over the running of his own family, he would need massive amounts of money. Being just one of many heroin importers wouldn't be enough. He needed to become the sole wholesale supplier of heroin into the USA.
He wanted control of that spigot where he could turn it on and off and control the price.
The colossal profits from controlling the heroin trade in America would bankroll his quest for power.
So it was just a matter of when he got out, he was going to make sure that he controlled it all.
Then, as Galante languished behind bars, out on the city's streets, events conspired to help his plan.
While he was in prison, there was a rebellion within the Bonanno family, and it was largely over narcotics.
The old leader he respected, Joe Bonanno, was forced to retire. Many of the capos, or captains that served under him, were killed or retired as well. And the Bonannos also went to war with the other Mafia families. Leaderless and in chaos, a power vacuum opened up. Eventually, in 1974, Philip Rastelli was appointed as the head of Galante's crime family. But he was under police investigation and about to be sent to prison. So, the Bonannos were ripe for takeover, and Galante began to concoct even bolder plans. He wouldn't just take over his own family. He wanted to take on the biggest family in New York, the Gambinos. Run by Carlo Gambino, it had become the city's toughest clan with the most profitable rackets and the deadliest killers. Galante's ambition was to crush the Gambinos and maybe one day become the head of all the Mafia, the so-called boss of bosses. His warders, meanwhile, categorized him as having a psychopathic personality disorder. But whatever his personality failings, outside the prison walls, circumstances continued to help him realize his master plan. Heroin, his main money spinner, was becoming ever more popular.
Heroin use was on the uprise because there was so much of it, and the price was right.
In the ghettos of New York, heroin was now the drug of choice. But local law enforcement couldn't understand how the supply was growing by so much, as former detective Bill Clark explains.
We really weren't hip to just the whole drug trafficking thing, where it was coming from. We didn't realize the hand that the Mafia played in it. As time went on, we realized how far behind it they were, including Carmine Galante. Anytime there's a big pool of money around, somebody's going to try to get into it.
The millions of dollars that were being made, it was astronomical.
The number of registered addicts had boomed from 50,000 at the time of Galante's arrest to 500,000. Politicians attempted to stem the tide, but they failed.
It destroyed a lot of lives. When I first became a policeman, heroin was the drug of choice. Very few working class neighborhoods that weren't losing their sons or daughters to the heroin trafficking and to heroin use.
Well, the addicts, of course, are the end products of it, and you take an addict who had an average habit of $100 or $200 a day, think of all the stuff he has to rob and all the muggings and robberies, and that had a severe effect on what was going on in the United States.
But to exploit the growing demand and to realize his plan, now Galante had to get free. This seemed fanciful until, right in the middle of the heroin craze, his wish was granted. The man with the borderline personality disorder was paroled in 1974 for good behavior, on condition he didn't consort with known felons. After 12 years of careful plotting, the timing could not have been better. He was ready to set his plan into motion. Galante got stuck in immediately with a hectic schedule. First, he got his own house in order.
Galante didn't miss a beat.
When he came out of jail, he started right away.
He moved to fill the leadership vacuum at the top of the Bonanno family. With Philip Rastelli starting a long jail term, Galante assumed the role of acting boss. Then, he laid down a marker. He settled any scores with rivals who had moved in on his business interests while he was in prison.
He was homicidal, quite frankly. He had killed a number of people. He was feared.
The other people around him were absolutely petrified of him.
That made him acceptable as a leader of predators. Not simply a predator himself, but a leader of predators.
Next, he returned to his jet-setting ways.
He wasted no time in solidifying the idea that he would be the main importer of the heroin through these various means that he set up.
He went to Miami, Dallas, Los Angeles, even Disneyland, all the time doing deals with his old associates. And Galante once again hoovered up more heroin supplies at source from the Sicilians.
He had that pipeline open, and there was such an upsurge of heroin coming into the United States.
The pipeline worked so well because Galante had a novel way to bring the heroin in.
When Galante got out, they established a means of bringing in major amounts of heroin.
Airliners arriving in New York throughout the 1970s often had a secret cargo in their hold.
They were bringing heroin in on Alitalia flights. Every flight that left Milan, Italy, every day, a suitcase or two was put on the flight and unaccompanied.
The suitcases were stuffed with pure heroin.
When it landed at JFK, of course, the suitcases were marked.
A Mafia baggage handler would remove the marked suitcase before it even went through customs and pass it on into the network. It worked beautifully.
You're talking about possibly 40 kilos of heroin coming in every day.
Bringing in the drugs was one thing, but Galante needed a distribution network. So he hit upon the idea of using pizza parlors as outlets. It just so happened, this gave him a chance to strike back at his rivals, the Gambino family. The Gambino crime family had dominated the cheese and pizza industries for years. They made money by monopolizing the cost of food supplies to the pizza parlors and chasing away competition. Then, a spate of fires at pizza parlors signaled a new front in Galante's heroin campaign. As the Gambino's restaurants burned, new pizza parlors owned by Galante were opened up in their place. And Galante used them to distribute vast amounts of heroin to the dealers.
It would just be distributed. A kilo came in, his people would distribute that pure kilo.
They would sell it to the black drug dealers who were taking all the heat for this.
In short time, Galante once again built a vast international drugs network. He dominated importation and distribution. Drug agent Frank Panessa witnessed this firsthand.
The money that they were making, and not only through the Northeast, he had distribution throughout the United States. I dealt with people in Puerto Rico that were getting their heroin from Galante's people.
He had achieved all this in just 4 years since coming out of jail. It was a ruthlessly fast rise to power, built on fear.
One time, an FBI agent who had infiltrated the family looked in and he said, "He doesn't look like much." He's an old, short guy. And the other gangsters said, "Look out, he's mean." They were afraid of him. Don't mess with him.
At this stage, Galante was only dealing in pure heroin, and he had a particularly unpleasant way of testing its purity. He became infamous at this time for what he called the black man test. An addict would be abducted from Harlem and drugged with 2 bags of heroin. If he died in a set time frame, the drug was pure. But as time went on, Galante began to want even more.
Galante was his own worst enemy. He was making those millions of dollars, but yet he had the greed, and he was greedy. So he would put a whack on it. He would add quinine to it, so something that was 90% heroin, he would whack it so it was 70% heroin and make even more money selling it as pure heroin.
Driven by such greed, his business went from strength to strength. Everything was going well. He was making vast amounts of money and was succeeding in his ambition to become a boss in all but name. The only thing that might spoil his meteoric climb to power was either the law or jealousy from other mobsters who resented his growing dominance. In 1978, it was the law that came knocking first. Galante was arrested and charged with violating the terms of his parole and consorting with known felons. He had been spotted with other criminals, most notably at a Disneyland meeting 3 years earlier. It looked like he would be back behind bars, just as everything was going so well. But once again, he got away with it. Enter Galante's attorney, Roy Cohn. Cohn was a controversial figure who had started his career on many high-profile Senate committees, like the McCarthy hearings. But nowadays, he represented a number of infamous Mafia clients. Cohn had been charged with jewelry tampering and perjury and was now seen as too cozy with the mob. Nevertheless, he was an undisputed star when it came to getting Mafia men off the hook. Cohn was Galante's less-than-secret weapon to ensure he didn't do yet more time. And it worked for him. In 1978, Cohn succeeded in getting the parole violation charge overturned. And Galante became yet another success story for the mob-friendly lawyer. With law enforcement out of the way, Galante could now turn his attention to an even more pressing threat: his jealous fellow mobsters. Galante was not stupid. He knew they wanted a piece of his drugs profits. But he thought he had the perfect solution: a foolproof way to protect himself. He recruited a band of specialist killers, imported directly from his Sicilian homeland and the same town as his family, Castelmare del Golfo. The derogatory nickname for these men was Zips, and they had well-defined roles.
The Zips were Sicilians brought over by Galante to run the pizza shops that they had all over New York and Pennsylvania, not only to distribute the heroin, but to use these Zips for murders and anything else that they needed from them.
For Galante, the Zips were not soft like American gangsters, but schooled in the old-fashioned ways of doing things, and their loyalty was legendary. The other advantage the Zips had was no criminal record in the States.
They bring them over here because nobody knows them.
The Zips appealed to Galante on another level too. They were happy to kill women, children, whoever.
The Zips would kill anybody they were assigned to kill. American hitmen did not like the idea of shooting policemen, prosecutors, or judges. They were off limits to most of the mob. But the Zips would take a contract on anybody.
With rival factions in his own family, most notably supporters of Philip Rastelli and further enemies like the Gambinos, Galante used the Zips to make sure no one messed with him. Two of his most trusted Zips were Cesare Bonaventre, known as the Tall Guy, and his cousin, Baldo Amato.
Well, Cesare was a very imposing figure. He was 6'7". You know, the type that if he had a mirror in front of him, he'd constantly be staring into the mirror. He was a very vain person. Baldo Amato and Cesare Bonaventre were responsible for murders. They were used to collect money because they did a lot of shylocking. They controlled card games in Brooklyn, and if somebody didn't pay up with the money that they lost, they would send out Cesare Bonaventre and Amato.
To ensure their loyalty further, The Zips were rewarded by being made into the crime family. In other words, formally initiated and given their own money-making operations.
All of a sudden to come here and have a beautiful house and have money in the bank and money in cars and stuff, they felt that they're very much indebted to the people that brought them here.
With the Zips guarding his every move, Galante felt untouchable.
Oh, without a doubt, he would feel safe with them. He was the one that recruited them. He was the one that made them. They were making major money with him.
As a result, he didn't even bother to carry a gun. At the height of his success, not only was Galante shifting millions of dollars worth of heroin a year, he was taking charge as head of the family. And surrounded by loyal guards, he thought he was invulnerable. The fact was, whilst Galante was seemingly in charge, the respect accorded him was often fickle, and Galante failed to appreciate the looming danger. His money was making other mobsters jealous, and many still refused to recognize his status as self-proclaimed head of the family. Especially supporters of the imprisoned Bonanno family boss, Philip Ristelli. Ristelli hated that Galante was exploiting the power vacuum and trying to steal his job. So as the summer heat began to settle on New York, dark forces were at work.
One faction of the Bonanno family did not like him heading the family. They made an alliance with a faction of the Gambino family, the underboss, Nello Della Croce, who was very, very powerful for an underboss.
This alliance with Della Croce would prove to be deadly. On July the 12th, 1979, Galante's driver dropped him off at Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue. It was his cousin's restaurant, and Galante was visiting to wish him well on a forthcoming trip.
Now you have to see the layout. I'll give you the layout. It's a long, narrow restaurant. You come in the front door of Knickerbocker Avenue, and in the back of the restaurant, there's a garden cafe with tables and chairs.
He ate there many times. He had his two trusted bodyguards who were armed.
With Cesare Bonaventre and Baldo Amato watching over him, he felt safe.
He had a friend that he met there. He had the restaurant owner. They had just had a big meal.
He's about to light a cigar when the three shooters come in.
These three people walked in and just blew them away.
Galante was gunned down, cigar in mouth. Joe Terrano, the cousin, was also felled. So too was the other lunch companion, Leonardo Coppolo. News of the shooting reached police detective Bill Clark.
I'm riding in the car and I hear a job come over the radio. Shots fired, 3 guys with ski masks. Sounded like it might be the real deal.
The police rushed to the restaurant. The scene inside was horrific.
The crime scene at Joe and Mary's restaurant was chaos.
Well, when you stepped into the yard, the first person that probably was shot was the owner of the restaurant, Mr. Terrano. He was laying right there with a head wound. Just on the other side of this table with a big gallon of red wine was Carmine, and he had fallen back in his chair. He had the cigar in his mouth. And then around the other side of the table in the corner was Leonardo Coppolo. and his brains were just laying out next to him. And I didn't know who these people were at the time, so I took his wallet out, and it was him. So I got on the phone, I called the chief of detectives, I called my borough, my boss, everybody, let everybody know.
Local news photographers managed to grab a shot of Galante, splayed out by the unfinished meal. It became an iconic image of the Mafia's bloody reality.
That was the famous picture that went out across the world.
It was such a perfect hit that it entered Mafia folklore. As investigators dug deeper, they soon realized it was a carefully devised assassination.
It was well planned because a car was waiting for them outside the restaurant, and they got away with it.
The getaway car was recovered a few blocks away. And there was an even greater puzzle. Where were the Zip bodyguards? Witnesses spoke of two other men in leather jackets, fitting the description of Cesare Bonaventre and Baldo Amato, hurrying away from the crime scene. It looked like the Zip bodyguards, supposed to protect Galante, had betrayed him. For the New York police and the FBI, it became one of their most high-profile cases. They needed to solve it to show they were coming down hard on organized crime. In the end, the only clue as to what had gone on came thanks to a stroke of good luck. Covert surveillance of a meeting of Gambino family men at a social club showed something interesting.
They started the camera going right across from the Ravenite Social Club of everything happening there.
They saw some of the Bonanno faction come over and give high fives with Nello Della Croce's people there.
These guys go up and it's like Anello Della Croce, big hug and kiss, and it was like, it was everything but a touchdown signal in the end zone. This is right after the Galante killing.
And that really gave us the information that it was a mob commission sanctioned hit.
The surveillance evidence would lead to the only conviction to date. One of the group, Anthony Bruno Indelicado, was charged as one of Galante's masked killers. No one else stood trial. This included the two Zips seen fleeing the shooting.
They turned themselves in to be interviewed a couple of days later, and they had their attorney with them, and they refused anything I asked them.
The motive for the murder, however, was clear. Galante had become rich through drugs and refused to share his wealth. This had made enemies both inside and outside his own family.
It was just too much money for them to pass up. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars.
His determination to replace Rastelli as Bonanno family boss merely added to the list of those who wanted to kill him.
It's one of those situations where you make a lot of enemies, and your enemies get together and decide you should go.
There's a clue as to why the Zips turned on him. After Galante's death, Cesare Bonaventre took over his heroin business. He continued to distribute the drug by exploiting what became known as the pizza connection, and Bonaventre made even more money.
Just the cell that I was involved in was bringing in $1 million a day. So that's $350 million a year. Major Fortune 500 companies don't make that type of money. And that's how big it was.
But a chance encounter on an airliner ended the pizza connection era. Bundles of cash wrapped in aprons from a pizza parlor gave away the network.
Federal law enforcement officials are celebrating what they consider to be a major victory in their war against organized crime. A former head of the Sicilian Mafia, and 16 other reputed organized crime figures convicted yesterday of running one of the biggest heroin smuggling rings ever uncovered.
A showcase trial in 1985 brought the pizza connection to an end. Since Galante's death and the dismantling of the pizza connection, the Mafia's involvement in drugs has waned. Other ethnic groups moved in, and new drugs rose in popularity. The French connection has been replaced by new smuggling routes and new drug lords. As for Carmine Galante, his legacy is unusual even by Mafia standards. He showed that focus and sheer determination could get you far and fast, even after 12 years in prison. But his spectacular killing showed you can be too ambitious and too greedy, even for the Mafia.
He wanted to be the guy. He wanted to be the geek. But he never made it.
Carmine was stepping up into a position that they didn't want him in, and that's what got him killed.
Galante was a ruthless street rat thug who certainly got what he deserved.
In the end, he was so loathed that he was even refused a Catholic funeral mass. What's more, that rare thing in Mafia circles, he was buried surrounded by just a tiny group of close family. Few of his wider crime family bothered to pay respect. A true sign in the Mafia of an unloved and feared man. A final insult for someone hated by those who knew him.